whole idea, don't ever explain by malice what can be explained by incompetence, that's also an important rule. Like slow moving, stupid, internally friction filled bureaucracies, like that's a real thing. And the fact that we have a lot of systems that are super ossified and are not good at sense making and not agile in their response, like that's a real thing. So you can certainly ascribe a lot of stuff to that. Where there are groups that seem to have good intel and the agentic capacity to act and took the wrong actions, it's more interesting. You still don't necessarily know what the motive was. And this is one of the interesting things about like motive is something that is outside of the domain of the formal methods of science, which is why social science is called a soft science, because I can't measure your motive. I can't do a third person measure and repetition on that measure. But can't I measure your brain? Well, we don't really have perfect one-for-one neural correlates, right? So I can observe your action, and then I have to try and infer motive and belief. And the inference is a big step. Now, maybe you wrote an email, and I can find your email, and you express it or whatever. So this is where people have to be careful if they actually want to try to do sense making well, to just look at where did I make a logical leap and what was my basis to make that leap, and how much of a, what are the different answers that it could be here, and let's run all of them. And then how do I say for this particular premise, how would I falsify this or verify this? Or if this was true, what other things would be true that I can look for? If this was false, what other things might be true that I can look for? The certainty of this is just a virus, everybody's doing the best they can. The political party I don't like is kind of at fault for the bad response. And fuck those guys, but we just need to band together and kind of help our political party win this next time and solve the virus and whatever, and international participation. The certainty of that, or the certainty of we know the cabal that is organizing this whole thing for 5G mind control or whatever, they're both comforting in a certain way. Now, the bias here that I find interesting is there's lots of nuance, so I'm going to oversimplify, but I definitely see people that have a towards or away from conspiracy bias that corresponds with their general bias of how they relate to authorities. And like I said, I'm oversimplifying, but the oversimplification is a starting place for anybody. And I'm going to even postulate where this comes from, but again, not all the time. This is a pattern that we can observe enough of the time that it's interesting to look at. The reason I'm careful with saying things like that is because when someone over norms their patterns, that's one of the places that their sense making becomes bad. I have seen relatively often people who generally think that government bodies are kind of lame and ossified and whatever, but mostly regulate in the right interests. You can largely trust authorities. The universities mostly say true stuff, whatever things. Those people generally trust the authorities, also generally have a frame that things are mostly getting better in the world. Right now, a lot less people have that frame, but in general, that frame. And generally, not always, those people did better in childhood, like at school, in sports. Oftentimes their parents were either more successful or they did better relative to them. And so they had this experience that the system actually works for me and that the authorities are actually trustworthy. And I have a good relationship with them. And that creates a kind of intuitive felt sense. So it's a kind of like the symbol grounding felt sense, where then even if they're in another environment where that's not true, and it was true in the little microenvironment of their childhood, that's still the felt sense. And then they sometimes will keep that forever, or they have to be disabused of it somewhat painfully at some point. Now, other people who have the general sense that most authorities are probably corrupt and probably abusing power, and that most institutions can't be trusted, and that people with less power can be more trusted, and that there is usually some process of corruption that is required for climbing power ladders. Those people generally weren't very successful at climbing the ladders early. and oftentimes had authorities around that abused power or that were like negative experience with them, whether it was parents or school or church or whatever it was. Not always, but I'm giving an example of a kind of bias that can occur, which is a towards or against authority bias, a kind of result that can happen, more likely to believe in conspiracies that the authorities are bad or more likely to reject that the authorities are bad, and a kind of developmental environment that could give rise to it. There's other developmental environments that could give rise to it, and there's other biases involved in conspiracy, but just one example of a developmental pathway.